The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic, a sound Margaret Walsh had stopped noticing around year 2. Year 3 of night shifts at Cedar Creek Medical felt the same as year 1, except her feet hurt more and the coffee tasted worse. She moved through the cardiac ward with her medication cart, the plastic wheels squeaking on linoleum that smelled like ammonia and something underneath it, something organic and faintly wrong that no amount of floor wax could mask. Vitals check-in room for 12. Then 415. Room for 20 was empty, beds stripped and disinfected, waiting for the next person who would arrive broken and trust her with their survival. Margaret had careful hands. Steady hands. The kind of hands that could draw blood without a patient even noticing the needle, that could adjust and foredrip to exactly 0.3 milliliters per minute without a second glance at the pump. She'd been told once, years ago, that she had hands like a surgeon's. She hadn't corrected the person. Hands like hers had held more than just fours. They'd applied tourniquets in the Hindu Kush at 3 in the morning with insurgent fire cracking past her ear. They'd held pressure on wounds while a teammate's blood soaked through her combat gloves. Those hands belonged to a different woman in a different lifetime, and Margaret kept them busy in the present tense, measuring out medications in paper cups, checking that the pharmacy labels matched the patient charts, noting every small discrepancy that made her jaw tighten. That's where Dr. Mercer noticed her. Not at the nurses' station making jokes like the others did, not charming the residents with war stories or laughing at their mistakes. Margaret worked alone, her badge clipped to her scrub pocket, her eyes moving across the supply invoices and inventory reports with the kind of focus most nurses reserved for critical patients. She was checking counts in a surgical supply closet when she noticed the numbers didn't add up. Lumenis surgical lasers listed at $47,000 per unit, 8 units shipped, but the physical inventory showed only 4 on the shelves. Someone was documenting phantom supplies, padding the invoices, and the markup going to whoever was authorizing the purchases was substantial enough to notice. Margaret made a note on the discrepancy form. Standard procedure. The kind of thing that kept hospitals running honestly. Dr. Mercer made his own note that day. Not about supply chains or inventory control, but about a particular nurse on the night shift who kept her head down and didn't know how to mind her own business. He'd built something beautiful over the last 18 months, a kickback arrangement with MedTech Solutions that was generating approximately $3,200 per month, deposited into an offshore account that bore no relation to his official income. 8 surgical lasers at $47,000 per unit could become 16 on a forged manifest. 15 on the invoices, only 4 actually needed. The difference, over $600,000 in overage, split cleanly between the MedTech account manager and himself. It was elegant, sustainable, and completely dependent on no one asking difficult questions about supply counts. Margaret didn't know any of this yet. She was thinking about the flag instead, the one she'd kept folded in her locker since the week before the Pentagon ordered her service record sealed. Staff Sergeant Riley had pressed it into her hands, the flag from her teammate's casket, because Riley's widow wanted someone who'd been there to have it, someone who would remember what they were fighting for before it all got classified and erased. Captain Margaret Walsh, Combat Rescue Officer, call sign Reaper 6, had no official record of 3 tours in Afghanistan. No paperwork confirming her Silver Star. No documentation of the operation in the Hindu Kush that had gone sideways in a way that required a Pentagon liaison to show up and tell her that everything she'd done there was now retroactively classified, that her service record would be sealed, that she would need to resign her commission quietly and never speak about what happened in those mountains again. So she was a nurse now. A good one. The kind who checked inventory carefully and didn't ask questions about things that weren't her concern, except she did ask questions. The flag stayed folded in her locker, behind the protein bars she ate on break, and no one at Cedar Creek Medical knew it was there. Room for 47 got a new patient on a Tuesday, admitted through the ER with a cardiac event that stabilized after the EKG came back showing nothing acute. The colonel was in his 60s, Air Force insignia still visible in the crease of his shoulders even in a hospital gown, his eyes moving across the room with the kind of tactical awareness that made Margaret pause when she walked in. Those eyes had seen things. Combat things. The same way her own eyes had seen things, though she doubted he'd recognize that in her face. She was just the night nurse, the aging woman with careful hands who took his vitals without comment. His forearm bore a tattoo, faded blue ink against weathered skin. Margaret Walsh, Hindu Kush. The letters were small, precise, the kind of thing someone got done in a combat zone or never got done at all. Her name. Her call sign location. On a colonel's arm, inked permanently into his skin for reasons she couldn't afford to examine. Margaret checked his oxygen saturation, 96%, stable, and his blood pressure, methodical and professional, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She didn't look at the tattoo. She didn't look at his face. She kept her expression empty the way she'd learned to keep it, because the alternative was to acknowledge something that the Pentagon had told her didn't exist. The colonel's eyes moved across her as she worked, polite and distant, the way you look at a medical technician you'll never see again. No recognition. No spark of connection across the years of operational silence. Margaret documented his vitals in the chart: blood pressure 142/88, heart rate 67, respiration 16, temperature 98.1 Fahrenheit, and left the room with her medication cart, her face completely blank, her jaw clenched in a way she only allowed when she was alone. The flag was in her locker. The tattoo was on his arm. And neither of them could acknowledge what those two facts meant, because the Pentagon had made it illegal for Margaret to exist as anything other than a civilian nurse with no history. Dr. Mercer caught up with her at the nurse's station 20 minutes later. His pen was tapping against his clipboard again, the same rhythm she'd heard him use when he was thinking about money or power or ways to make people smaller. He smiled at her, a smile like a smile, technically, but the muscles in his face had forgotten how to make it genuine. He was tall, the kind of tall that made doorways feel smaller, and he wore his white coat the way colonizers wore flags. Gold cufflinks. A watch that probably cost more than Margaret made in 6 months. Found any other irregularities worth documenting? He asked, his voice smooth as diesel fuel, and Margaret felt something in her chest compress into a small hard thing. He knew about the discrepancy form. He'd been waiting to see if she'd follow protocol. Just supply counts, Margaret said. Her voice was quiet, even, the deferential tone of someone who understood her place in the hospital hierarchy. Numbers didn't match the manifest. Dr. Mercer's smile didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, some calculation running behind the surface. Medical records said those supplies were administered, he said. Sometimes inventory lags behind documentation. Happens all the time. The supplies were never received, Margaret said carefully. There was no invoice matching the administration date. He tapped his pen once more, a deliberate sound, final and cold. I'd be careful about making assumptions about things outside your scope, he said. Then he turned away, his white coat moving like a sail in still water, leaving her standing at the station with the knowledge that she'd just made an enemy of someone with institutional power and nothing to lose. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the same sound they always made, and Margaret pulled up the next patient's chart because standing still wasn't an option. Moving was always the safer choice. Thursday morning arrived like every other Thursday morning at Cedar Creek Medical, fluorescent lights humming their monotonous drone, the smell of antiseptic cutting through the stale coffee that had been brewing since 6 a.m., and Dr. Mercer in his pressed white coat leading grand rounds like a conductor with an orchestra of nervous residents trailing behind him. Margaret pushed the medication cart down the third-floor corridor, her hands moving through the familiar rhythm of her work, checking names, verifying dosages, the small mechanical motions that filled her shifts. She had worked night shift for 3 years, then volunteered for day coverage this week to cover a staffing shortage. A mistake, she realized now. Nights were safer. Nights were invisible. The procession rounded the corner near room for 47. 12 residents, 3 attending physicians, and Dr. Mercer, whose presence had a way of making the hallway feel smaller, the air heavier. Margaret saw them coming and kept her eyes on the medication cart, counting bottles the way soldiers count ammunition. 1, 2, 3. Nurse Walsh, Mercer's voice cut across the hallway like a blade. Not a request. A command with an audience. Would you mind stepping away from your cart for just a moment? She turned. Her jaw tightened. She stepped back from the medication cart and waited, her hands falling naturally to her sides, her posture perfectly neutral. Mercer was already moving toward room for 47, gesturing for the residents to gather. Margaret followed, because refusal wasn't an option that existed in hospital hierarchies. The colonel lay in his bed, post-cardiac event, his chest rising and falling beneath the hospital gown, the faded tattoo on his forearm visible before the sleeve covered it again. Margaret had seen that tattoo 3 times now. Asterisk Margaret Walsh, Hindu Kush. Asterisk the call sign that belonged to someone else. Someone who didn't exist anymore. Nurse Walsh has been with us for 3 years, Mercer announced, loud enough for the residents to stop their murmuring and pay attention. Yet she continues to use techniques from, let me see, at least 2005 or thereabouts. He paused. A theatrical pause. The kind designed to generate small laughs. I want our residents to understand what outdated wound care looks like. Nurse Walsh, would you explain your dressing change methodology for our future physicians? Margaret said nothing. She moved to the colonel's bedside and began unwrapping the dressing on his left arm with steady, methodical hands. The residents leaned in. Mercer positioned himself between her and the light, casting a shadow across her work like he owned the space. Notice the excessive gauze padding, he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. Notice the lack of absorption optimization. This is grandma protocol, ladies and gentlemen. This is what happens when someone refuses to keep pace with modern medical standards. He turned to Margaret directly. Tell me, Nurse Walsh, have you considered attending a continuing education course? The hospital offers them free. Even for staff who've been here a while. The word even hung in the air like an insult wrapped in professional language. Margaret's neck flushed, a physical response she couldn't control, though her face remained expressionless. Her jaw was set so tightly that a muscle worked along her right temple. She said nothing. She finished the dressing change with precision, each movement deliberate and controlled, her fingers steady as surgical instruments despite the pressure of being watched, critiqued, and diminished in front of an entire medical team. Grandma protocol, Mercer said again, to the residents this time. Remember that term. It's what we're trying to move away from. Margaret adjusted the fall line. Once. Then she stepped back and returned to her medication cart without a word, without looking at anyone, her stride even, her hands not trembling. Moving was always the safer choice. Standing still was what got people killed. But that wasn't the worst part. By 10:06 a.m., 2 junior residents were standing by the vending machine on the 3rd floor, their voices low but not low enough. Margaret was retrieving supplies from the storage room 20 feet away, separated from them by a partially open door, and she heard every word. Did you see her technique? One of them laughed, mimicking slow, exaggerated hand movements. Grandma protocol. Like she's treating wounds from a Civil War field hospital. The old nurse who thinks she knows better than physicians, the other one said, and they both laughed again. The kind of laughter that felt safe in a hierarchy, protected by youth and credentials. Margaret emerged from the storage room with her supplies held against her chest. She passed directly between them, close enough that her shoulder nearly brushed the first resident's arm. Her face was a mask. No flush. No tremor. No acknowledgement of the laughter that died the moment they realized she'd heard everything. She kept walking down the hallway with the same stride, the same composure, as if they were beneath her notice. As if their cruelty was just noise. That afternoon, Mercer stood near the security checkpoint speaking with the chief of hospital security, a man named Halston who worked the day shift. Margaret was reviewing medication charts at the nurse's station maybe 15 feet away, positioned so she could see them but not obviously looking. Mercer's voice carried. We should have proper escort protocols ready for any upcoming terminations, Mercer said, his tone casual, conversational. Standard protocol now at most medical centers. I'd like to make sure your team is prepared for rapid staff departures, should they become necessary. He turned his head. His eyes found Margaret's face across the distance. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The message was so clear it might as well have been written in the hospital's sterile water, *, I'm going to fire you. It's just a matter of timing. *. Margaret's knuckles whitened on the edge of the medication cart. For exactly 3 seconds, the tension in her shoulders was visible. The trembling wasn't fear, though. It was restraint. It was the kind of control that came from understanding exactly how much damage she could do if she let herself. From knowing that walking away was the only option left. She released the cart and returned to her work. The rest of the shift passed in a normal rhythm: vitals, medications, documentation, the endless mechanical tasks that filled nursing days. By evening, Margaret had managed to put most of the humiliation away in the same compartment where she kept everything else she wasn't allowed to feel. The compartment that had served her well for 20 years of service. At 9:15 p.m., she was due for a patient check-in room for 47. The colonel was sleeping, his full line running clear, his oxygen saturation at a comfortable 94% on 2 liters. She moved quietly, checking his vitals without disturbing him, recording the numbers on his chart. His eyes opened slightly as she adjusted his blanket. "Nurse," he said, his voice hoarse from the tubes they'd removed that morning. "Thank you for checking on me." She nodded once. Professional. Distant. His eyes passed over her face with polite blankness, no spark of recognition, no moment of connection between them. Just a patient grateful for basic nursing care from a woman whose name was written on his skin but whose face he had never learned. Margaret finished the vitals check and stepped back into the hallway, where the night shift was beginning to settle into its slower rhythm. She had 5 more hours until her shift ended. 5 more hours of movement, of professional distance, of pretending that nothing in her life was unraveling. She was reaching for the medication cart when her radio crackled, not an emergency, just routine. She pushed the cart forward, toward the next room, the next patient, the next opportunity to be useful and invisible. What she didn't know was that Dr. Mercer was already drafting the termination paperwork in his office. What she didn't know was that he'd made 3 phone calls to allies in hospital administration, establishing a clear paper trail of policy violations he could manufacture at will. What she didn't know was that her days at Cedar Creek Medical were measured not in weeks, but in hours. She checked the next patients for. The line was clean. The flow was steady. She moved on. At 2:53 a.m., during the quiet of the graveyard shift, Margaret was doing her rounds again. The hospital had settled into that peculiar stillness that happened in the deepest part of the night: fewer staff, fewer visitors, fewer people moving through the corridors. Just the constant hum of machines and the occasional beep of a monitor somewhere down a hallway. She entered room for 47 and immediately noticed something wrong. The colonel's breathing pattern had changed in the past 2 hours. His chest rise was uneven, left side shallow, right side deeper. His oxygen saturation reading flickered between 91 and 88. The monitor showed his heart rate climbing toward 118. Margaret moved closer, her training taking over completely. She watched his chest. Left side wasn't expanding properly. She placed her hands on his ribs, feeling the rise and fall. Deviated. His trachea was shifted to the left. She checked his neck veins, distended. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in his chest cavity, collapsing his lung, building pressure against his heart. In 90 seconds, his blood pressure would drop. In 2 minutes, his heart would go into arrest. The crash cart was 2 hallways away. The on-call physician was in the ER with a level 1 trauma. The on-call anesthesiologist was 20 minutes out. She had maybe 90 seconds. Margaret moved to the supply cabinet with controlled speed. Large bore needle. She found the kit in the crash supply drawer, a 14-gauge angiocath needle, exactly what she needed. She counted his ribs with her fingers, found the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line. The needle was in her hand, her finger steady as a surgical laser. The colonel's oxygen saturation was dropping fast, 87, 84, 80. She didn't hesitate. She didn't call for backup. Muscle memory took over completely, the same muscle memory that had guided her hands through 3 tours of combat medicine, through operating on wounded soldiers in dusty tents with nothing but flashlight and experience. The needle slid between his ribs with practiced precision, at the right angle, at the right depth. The hiss of air escaping was immediate and unmistakable, the sound of a life being saved in the space between one breath and the next. His chest expanded. Color returned to his face almost immediately. His oxygen saturation climbed, 85, 88, 92, 95. The crash cart arrived 40 seconds later with Dr. Chen leading it, her voice calling out protocols that were suddenly unnecessary. Chen stared at the needle, at Margaret's steady hands, at the colonel now breathing normally with pink returning to his lips and cheeks. Margaret documented the procedure time on the chart with precision, 2:0 for AM, emergency needle decompression, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, immediate respiratory improvement. Each word clinical. Each word untraceable. Just a nurse following protocol in a moment of crisis. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A monitor beeped steadily in the distance. And then Margaret heard the sound of a phone camera shutter clicking rapidly from the doorway. Dr. Mercer stood framed in the doorway, his phone raised, photographing the scene. Photographing her hands. Photographing the needle. Photographing the evidence of exactly what Margaret had just done, exactly what he had been waiting for. His expression was calculating, his eyes moving from the needle to Margaret's face and back again. He lowered the phone slowly, smiled, and the smile was the smile of a hunter who had finally found something valuable enough to destroy. Margaret felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear. Something colder than that. She said nothing. She simply nodded once to Dr. Chen, stepped back from the bedside, and began reviewing the medication chart as if nothing had changed. As if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. As if Dr. Mercer didn't have exactly what he needed to end her career. Room for 47 sat at the end of the east corridor where the fluorescent lights hummed their tired song and the monitors beeped in lazy rhythm. Margaret checked her watch, 0200 hours. The colonel's chart lay open on the bedside table, vitals from the evening shift recorded in neat clinical handwriting. She'd been checking on him every 2 hours since Thursday night, and every time she approached his bed, she kept her eyes fixed on the machines instead of his face. It was easier that way. Safer. Less dangerous to pretend he was just another patient, one of the dozen she'd tended in 3 years at Cedar Creek Medical without incident, without recognition, without any crack in the wall she'd built between Captain Margaret Walsh and the woman who now carried a stethoscope instead of a rifle. But something was different tonight. Margaret stepped into the room and immediately felt it, the subtle wrongness in the air, the kind of wrongness that comes not from instruments but from instinct. The colonel's breathing pattern had changed. She could see it before the monitors even registered it, shallow, rapid, his chest rising with asymmetric effort. The left side lagged. Ribs expanded unevenly. His oxygen saturation read 94%, then 92%. The trend was downward. Not dramatic. Not yet. But unmistakably wrong. She moved closer without rushing. Rushing drew attention. Attention was the thing Margaret had spent 3 years avoiding. The colonel's eyes were closed, his face slack with sleep, unaware that something inside his chest was collapsing. Pneumothorax. The word came to her with the clarity of muscle memory, the part of her brain that had once been trained to diagnose battlefield injuries now running diagnosis on a surgical recovery case. Air in the pleural space. Not enough yet to trigger an alarm. Just enough to steal his oxygen one breath at a time. Margaret reached for the pulse oximeter and watched the numbers fall. 90, 88. The colonel's breathing quickened, his body trying to compensate, working harder as his lungs grew less efficient. His monitor showed the telltale signs now, slight peak T waves, the early electrical signature of hypoxia. This wasn't a minor pneumothorax. This was tension. This was trapped air building pressure against his heart, against his lungs, against the fragile mechanics of a recovery that had been progressing perfectly until this moment. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilation system cycling. Margaret's hand moved to the call button. That was the protocol. That was the step that required Dr. Mercer's authorization, that demanded she wait for physician oversight, that meant standing aside while the colonel's oxygen saturation fell into the 70s and his heart rate climbed toward 120. She could see it perfectly, the attending arriving in 12 minutes, maybe 10 if the operator found them quickly. She could hear the words already, the familiar clip of Dr. Mercer's voice explaining to the residents that early intervention was critical, that every second mattered, that hesitation cost lives. The irony of it struck her like a cold blade. But her hand didn't press the button. Instead, Margaret turned and moved to the crash cart positioned in the corner of the room, the one they never needed until they did. Her fingers found the large bore needle with the precision of someone who'd done this exact motion 10,000 times before, muscle memory bypassing thought entirely. 14-gauge angiocath needle. The weight of it in her palm felt like coming home. She tore the sterile package open with her teeth, a habit she'd picked up in the field where hands were often full and efficiency was measured in seconds, and her fingers found the anatomical landmarks on the colonel's chest with the same unconscious accuracy a musician uses to find the right fret. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. That's where the trapped air lived. That's where the pressure was building. The colonel's eyes flickered open as she swabbed his skin with antiseptic, the iodine smell sharp and chemical. His mouth moved. He tried to speak. She didn't hear the words because she was already moving, needle positioned, angle calculated, 3 years of night shifts stripped away and replaced by something older and deeper and infinitely more certain. The needle went in. For exactly 1 second, nothing happened. The room held its breath. The colonel's eyes widened, confusion crossing his face as a stranger performed an unauthorized procedure on his chest without permission, without explanation, without even a glance at his expression. And then came the hiss, the sound of trapped air escaping, the pneumothorax decompressing, the pressure releasing in a whisper that was somehow louder than any alarm. The numbers on the monitor shifted. His oxygen saturation climbed. 88, 91. 94, his breathing deepened, became less frantic, his body recognizing the return of space in his lungs. The peak T waves began to flatten. His heart rate settled. The colonel gasped, a deep, shuddering breath that was half reflex and half consciousness returning, and his eyes focused on Margaret's face for the first time, and in that moment there was something in his expression that flickered between gratitude and confusion and the dawning awareness that the quiet nurse in the purple scrubs had just saved his life using a procedure that no nurse at Cedar Creek Medical was authorized to perform. The crash cart burst through the door for seconds later, the resident medical team flooding in with defibrillator pads and 4 lines and the machinery of emergency medicine. They stopped when they saw the large bore needle already in place, the pneumothorax already decompressed, the colonel already breathing normally. The resident, a young man named Patel, looked at the needle, then at Margaret, then at the monitor showing stable vital signs, and his mouth opened and closed without producing words. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway behind the crash team, his face a careful mask of professional concern that shattered the moment his eyes registered what had happened. He saw the needle. He saw Margaret's hands, steady and practiced. He saw the colonel breathing, conscious, recovering, everything the tension pneumothorax was supposed to prevent. And he saw something else entirely, opportunity. His hand came up with his phone already in motion, camera positioning, and by the time Margaret looked away from her patient, the photograph was already taken. One image of Captain Margaret Walsh performing an invasive emergency procedure without physician authorization, without backup, without any of the institutional safeguards that Dr. Mercer had spent weeks learning how to weaponize. He didn't say anything. He just smiled, a thin, calculating smile like a knife showing its edge, and he turned and walked back out into the corridor, already composing the documentation in his mind. This was the evidence he'd been waiting for. This was the moment that transformed her heroism into her downfall. Margaret stood motionless as the resident examined the needle, as the nursing supervisor was called, as the slow machinery of institutional response began to grind into motion. Her hands were completely steady. Her breathing was completely controlled. but her eyes tracked Dr. Mercer's retreating figure with the focused intensity of a predator marking prey, and for the first time in 3 years, she let herself feel the cold metal certainty that had once been as familiar as breathing. She had crossed a line. She had violated protocol. She had saved a life. And in doing so, she had given him exactly what he needed to destroy her. The shift supervisor arrived at 0247 hours looking uncomfortable, which meant she already knew. At 0330, Margaret was escorted to her locker by security, a young man who wouldn't meet her eyes because he understood the unspoken language of hospital politics well enough to know that helping her was a losing bet. She packed in complete silence. The folded flag that had been pressed into her hands 3 years ago, the one she'd never explained to anyone because the explanation required access to classified files and Pentagon denials and a story that officially didn't exist. A photo of her son at 12, his gap-toothed smile frozen in better times. Her spare scrub top, still smelling faintly of hospital antiseptic and the particular staleness of the staff locker room. The metal door closed with a sound like a coffin lid. The drive home took 18 minutes. The Savannah humidity pressed against the windshield like a living thing, the late August heat making the air so thick you could see it wavering off the asphalt. She drove with both hands on the wheel at precisely the speed limit, her eyes focused forward, her mind locked into the compartmentalizer she'd learned before she turned 21. Don't think. Don't feel. Drive. At 1,400 hours, she sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago, and she stared at the folded flag without seeing it. Her son came through the door at 1,515 hours with his backpack still strapped to his shoulders and his mind already halfway to whatever homework crisis had occupied his afternoon. He stopped in the doorway and his entire body went rigid the way only teenagers can manage, that sudden recognition that something was fundamentally wrong with the world he'd left that morning. "Mom? Why are you home early?" Margaret tried to answer. Her mouth opened. Her hand started to shake, not from fear but from the effort of containing 3 years of accumulated silence, 3 years of lies told to protect him, 3 years of pretending that the nightmares that woke her at 0300 hours were just insomnia and that the scars on her ribs spelled out a past that no longer existed. The words that came out weren't words at all. Just the sound of breathing and something that might have been a sob or might have been something breaking. Mom. She couldn't explain. She couldn't tell him the truth. The truth was classified. The truth was dangerous. The truth was that his mother was a ghost pretending to be a nurse, and now that ghost had committed what the hospital would call an act of gross negligence and Dr. Mercer would call the end of her career. Her shoulders bent inward and her hands covered her face, and her son watched from the doorway in a moment of absolute stillness, watching his invincible mother shatter like glass, and that was perhaps the cruelest thing that had happened to either of them. Dr. Mercer moved through the hospital corridors like a man possessed by certainty. Within 60 minutes of the Colonel's revival, 60 minutes of watching oxygen saturation climb on a monitor he hadn't expected to see climb again, Mercer had his phone to his ear, speaking in measured tones to the hospital's chief compliance officer. He wasn't angry. Anger would have been messy. Instead, he was precise, methodical, building a case the way a mason lays brick. Each violation cited in triplicate. Each policy reference with paragraph number. Each allegation documented with photographs from his phone, images of Margaret's hands performing the needle decompression, images of her standing over the Colonel without physician authorization, images that could be reframed as recklessness in the hands of someone who knew how to tell a story to a board that cared more about liability than truth. Practicing outside scope of practice, Mercer said into the phone, his voice carrying the weight of wounded authority. That's the primary charge. A registered nurse performing an invasive surgical procedure, a needle decompression, is technically a physician-delegated task. She didn't wait. She didn't call. She acted unilaterally on a patient whose care was under my supervision. The compliance officer listened. Mercer had allies everywhere. 23 years of surgical rotations had built him a network of colleagues who understood how these things worked. You protected your own. You protected your reputation. You protected the institution because the institution protected you. Additionally, Mercer continued, unauthorized invasive procedure without physician oversight. There's documented precedent for immediate suspension pending review. I have photographic evidence. And frankly, I'm concerned about her mental state. She's been making comments about supply chain discrepancies that don't make sense. I wonder if there's a fitness for duty component here. This last part was genius. This last part would ensure Margaret wouldn't fight back. She couldn't fight back. A fitness for duty evaluation would dig into her past, into her records, into parts of her life that were supposed to stay buried. Mercer didn't know that. He was simply playing the game everyone played when they wanted someone gone quietly, but he had found, without realizing it, the one lever that would make Margaret accept her termination without a sound. By 2 p.m., the termination letter had been drafted. By 3 p.m., it was in an envelope sealed with the hospital's official letterhead. A courier delivered it to the nursing station while Margaret was finishing paperwork on the day's shift she had just begun, a shift that would turn out to be her last. The envelope sat on the counter beside the time clock, cream-colored paper, her name typed in professional sans serif. She opened it while standing at the sink. No one was watching. No one needed to watch, everyone already knew. The hospital moved through these terminations like a choreography, every step predetermined, every word in the letter written by lawyers who had written thousands of identical letters to thousands of other people who had made the mistake of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The letter cited paragraph 4.2.1 of the Hospital Procedure Manual. It cited unauthorized performance of delegated medical acts. It cited a failure to maintain the chain of physician command during emergency situations. It provided her with information about her final paycheck, about the continuation of her health benefits for 18 days, about her right to appeal within 30 days to the Human Resources Office. It was, in every measurable way, both completely thorough and entirely cold. Margaret read it once. She didn't read it twice. She had been fired before. That's what the Pentagon had done in 2019, when they had erased Captain Margaret Walsh from the official record, when they had told her to walk away from the life she had built and become someone else, someone smaller, someone who pushed medicine carts instead of saving lives in mountains where the air was so thin it felt like breathing through gauze. This felt like that. This felt like the world rearranging itself around her again, without her permission, without her input, the way it always did when she got close to mattering. She walked to her locker at 3:27 p.m. The locker was small, metal, painted a dull institutional beige. Inside was her extra pair of white shoes, a photo of her son at his high school graduation, a half-empty container of lip balm, and in the back corner, folded into a small precise square, the flag. The flag had been pressed into her hands by Sergeant Lisa Halloway's widow outside a church in Jacksonville in August 2019, 5 days before Margaret's military records were sealed and her official service record was deleted like a file in a computer being wiped clean. The widow had held Margaret's hands and said nothing, there were no words that made sense, and then she had placed the flag in her palms and closed Margaret's fingers around it. Margaret pulled the flag out now and tucked it under her arm. The locker door closed with a soft clang. She didn't remove anything else. She didn't take the photo of her son, she would buy a new one. Some things in life didn't matter anymore. Some things had already been left behind. The drive home took 32 minutes. She took the long route, avoiding the interstate, driving through the slower neighborhoods of Savannah where the Spanish moss hung from oak trees like grief made visible. The afternoon sun was brutal, temperature already climbing toward 90, the kind of heat that made you understand why people moved slowly in the South, why conversations happened at the speed of honey, why nothing could be rushed because rushing would only make you sweat more. She kept the windows up and the air conditioning off. She didn't know why. Maybe because she deserved the heat. Maybe because numbness was more efficient than thinking. At 2:11 p.m., she pulled into the driveway of the small 3-bedroom house on Maple Street that she had bought 7 years ago with money from a job she hadn't been supposed to have and a past she wasn't allowed to discuss. Her son's car was already in the driveway, a 2012 Honda Civic he had saved for since he was 14, working summer jobs, learning the value of discipline the way children of soldiers learn discipline without anyone needing to teach it. He was only supposed to be home at 3:45. School didn't end until 3:30. Traffic was a minimum of 15 minutes. He must have felt something. Kids could do that sometimes, sense when the ground beneath their family was shifting. Margaret sat in the driver's seat for 4 minutes without moving. Then she unbuckled her seatbelt and walked into the house. The air inside was cooler, the house accepting her, the walls that had held her through 3 years of 12-hour shifts welcoming her like a prayer answered. The kitchen was empty. The living room was empty. She climbed the stairs to find him sitting at the kitchen table, doing homework, or pretending to do homework, calculus textbook open, notebook blank, his pencil making small circles on the page that meant nothing. "Hi," he said, looking up. "Hi," she said. She sat down at the table across from him. She kept the flag under her arm. She didn't set it down, didn't explain it, couldn't explain it, not because she didn't know how, but because any explanation would be a lie. Her hands were trembling. Not from fear. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the sound her body made when it had been holding everything together for so long that letting go felt like falling. "Why are you home?" he asked. And that was the question, wasn't it? The simple question that required a complicated answer. The why that had no good response. She opened her mouth. Her shoulders bent forward like she was folding in on herself. Her hands came up to cover her face and the trembling became shaking and the shaking became something deeper, something that came from the part of her that had been stabbed twice while carrying a man through fire and had gotten back up both times because that's what soldiers did, that's what her body knew how to do, but now her body was remembering something else. It was remembering what it felt like to lose everything all at once. Her son moved his chair around the table and sat beside her without asking permission. He was 17. He had a calculus test on Friday. He had college applications due in 6 months. He had her entire life in front of him that she had been building for him one 12-hour shift at a time, and now she was sitting at their kitchen table with her shoulders shaking and a folded flag under her arm and no words in any language that would make this make sense to either of them. 48 hours after Margaret's termination notice went into the Cedar Creek Medical shredder, her son walked through those same sliding doors carrying a shadow box. The glass-fronted case held ribbons arranged in precise rows. Bronze beneath gold beneath silver. His shoulders were rigid as he approached the reception desk, and his voice cut through the afternoon lobby chatter like a scalpel through skin. "My mom was fired from here. These need to go to the board. Now." The receptionist's hands froze above her keyboard. In that lobby, the afternoon sun slanted through the windows at that particular angle that makes everything look like it's happening inside a photograph. Dr. Mercer stood 30 feet away, mid-conversation with 3 hospital board members near the atrium. He saw the shadow box first. Then the boy's face. Then he saw the ribbons, and his jaw did something between a clench and a twitch. The colonel was sitting in the cardiovascular recovery ward on the 3rd floor, still weak from the crisis, still processing why his breathing had come back when machines flatlined. But he had mobility now. A walker. Permission to move. He was standing at the ward window when the elevator chimed, when orderlies began whispering, when something shifted in the building's baseline electrical current. A nurse brought him downstairs. Brought him to the lobby where his chest had been saved by hands that moved like they had done this in 100 war zones. Brought him to the place where Margaret's son was holding up the medals, speaking in a voice that didn't shake. The colonel's eyes found the ribbons. His breath caught. Audible. A ragged intake of air that came from somewhere beneath his ribs where the pneumothorax had tried to kill him. He whispered hoarsely, "Reaper 6. That was her call sign. The words fell into the lobby like a dropped instrument tray. People turned. Phones lowered. Dr. Mercer's face lost its color in the way that happens when a man realizes he has made a catastrophic miscalculation. A Marine colonel who had accompanied the board members stepped forward. He was dressed in dress blues, the fabric crisp as new money, and his voice when he spoke was the kind of voice that had given orders in places Margaret had bled. He opened a folder. "Read aloud." His words echoed off the atrium's stone walls with the weight of official declaration. Captain Margaret Walsh, for conspicuous gallantry under fire while extracting wounded personnel from a compromised position in the Hindu Kush Mountains, sustained injuries consistent with combat operations while providing protection to fellow soldiers, continued mission performance despite physical trauma, demonstrated exceptional courage under enemy contact. Silence. The fluorescent hum above them suddenly deafening. Margaret's son stood motionless, still holding the shadow box, and for the first time since his mother collapsed at their kitchen table, something in his expression shifted from confusion toward understanding. A two-star general stepped from the group beside the Marine. His uniform carried decorations that caught the light like reflected fire. He came to attention with the formal precision of 30 years in service. His hand rose to his brow in a slow salute directed not at the Marine, not at the board members, but at the ribbons in the shadow box. His eyes tracked across them, pausing on the silver star, lingering on the two purple hearts stacked beneath it. The silence was so thick you could perform surgery in it. Dr. Mercer opened his mouth. The words came out strangled, trying to maintain the architecture of authority even as the walls collapsed around him. This is irrelevant to hospital policy. The procedures she performed were unauthorized regardless of her background. The compliance issue stands. The general's hand lowered. His eyes shifted toward Mercer with the weight of a weapons systems targeting lock. He raised his hand, palm forward. A single gesture. It required no words. Mercer's mouth closed. What happened next didn't just happen in the lobby. It echoed through every administrative office, every conference room, every supply closet where nurses whispered during breaks. By evening, a Pentagon liaison in a charcoal suit was walking through Cedar Creek Medical's administrative corridor, requesting a private briefing with hospital legal. The liaison presented documents. Declassified segments. Margaret's service jacket showed 2 combat deployments. 17 successful extractions under fire. The specific incident where she had been stabbed twice, once in the shoulder, once in the lateral abdomen, while physically shielding the colonel from attackers during exfiltration from a compromised position. The word exfiltration hung in the conference room air like something radioactive. Captain Walsh was honorably discharged, the liaison said, sliding photographs across the polished table. She was ordered to maintain operational security. That means she couldn't disclose her service without Pentagon authorization. She followed protocol. The hospital board chair, Dr. Harrison, looked at Mercer. Did you investigate why she had the technical skills to perform that needle decompression? Did you consider that a registered nurse might have additional training that wasn't in her civilian personnel file? Mercer had no answer. His hands were steady but his eyes were not. The nursing supervisor spoke next. She had found the supply inventory discrepancies in Mercer's files. Found the notation beside Margaret's name, flagged discrepancies 7/14. Submitted report 7/15. Complaint filed against employee 7/15, same day. An auditor confirmed what the supply numbers had been screaming. Kickback arrangements between Mercer and a medical equipment vendor worth $217,000 over 18 months. Margaret's inventory scrutiny threatened an ongoing quarterly payment schedule that kept Mercer's ex-wife's alimony current and funded a lake house in the Georgia Low Country. The board chair's next words were clipped, official, and final. Surgical privileges suspended pending investigation. Criminal referral made to the state medical board and federal authorities. 2 weeks later, criminal charges were filed. Identity theft for the kickback scheme. Fraudulent billing. Endangering a patient through malicious termination. By the end of the month, Dr. Mercer was sitting in a white medical supply van with the company logo emblazoned on its side, driving through Bluffton 40 miles south of Savannah. His hands on the steering wheel were steady, but they had no instruments anymore. No scalpel. No authority. No certainty. His phone buzzed. The viral video had passed 800,000 views. A patient's family member had recorded Mercer's hallway conversation 3 weeks prior. His voice on playback, "She's a relic with delusions of competence. The entire protocol she's suggesting is outdated. Frankly, she needs to go." The patient's family member had a husband in the Air Force. had understood, apparently, that erasing decorated veterans was not a thing that went unnoticed in certain circles. Mercer stared at the video on his phone. His hands began to shake. Not from cold. From the understanding that he had tried to erase a woman who had been trained to survive erasure, and in doing so, had erased himself. 48 hours after the revelation in the lobby, after the medals had been displayed and the general had rendered his salute, Margaret stood in Cedar Creek Medical's corridor. Not as an employee. Not yet. The hospital board had issued a formal written apology. Reinstatement offer. Back pay. The offer of a promotion to senior clinical educator. She had not answered yet. The colonel was walking now, the cane still necessary but his breathing clear as rain on glass. He approached her in the lobby where afternoon light slanted through the windows like something from a classical painting. Both his hands reached out. Both his hands clasped her wrist. "I couldn't recognize you before," he said, his voice still hoarse from intubation. "I was sedated. Half conscious. But I remember your voice. I remember you didn't leave me." Margaret's composure remained intact, but her eyes glinted with something that might have been water, might have been light. She nodded once. Her son stood beside her, still holding the shadow box. Margaret rested her hand on his shoulder. A general approached, handing her an official letter on Pentagon stationery. The classification had been lifted. She was authorized to acknowledge her service publicly. The erasure had been erased. Dr. Harrington, the board chair, shook her hand. "We're establishing a scholarship for veteran nurses. Your name. Your name on it." Margaret accepted quietly. The way she did everything. As they walked toward the exit, Margaret, her son, and the colonel following at his own pace with a walker, the colonel called out, "What will you do now?" Margaret glanced at her son. Then back at the colonel. "Keep working. It's what I know." The colonel smiled. Reaper 6 never stops. Later, in the nurse's locker room on the 4th floor, Margaret hung her new badge on its lanyard. She opened her locker. The folded flag from her teammate's widow was still there, pressed against the back wall in the dark. She lifted it carefully, pressed it to her chest for 3 seconds. Then placed it on the top shelf, visible now. Not hidden. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If you made it this far, you know the stories that don't get told are the ones that kill you. Comment below, what would you have done when Margaret's son walked into that lobby? And if you found this story worth your time, subscribe and like this video so more people know that heroes don't always wear uniforms, sometimes they wear scrubs, and sometimes it takes the world getting quiet before anyone finally sees them. Thank you for listening.